Seward's Folly is a term you'll encounter in any U.S. history textbook. It refers to the widespread belief at the time that the United States' acquisition of Alaska from Russia was a tremendous mistake. The U.S. paid $7.2 million, equivalent to over $150 million today, for what seemed like an expanse of desolate wilderness. It appeared to be a blunder of epic proportions, until Alaska revealed itself to be a treasure trove brimming with natural resources. But if Alaska's immense value was unknown, why did the United States agree to pay such a steep price? And did the people of the era truly believe it was a massive error in judgment? Today, we'll delve into the true motivation behind the U.S. purchase of Alaska from Russia. It's almost unimaginable to think of the United States today without Alaska as its final, often perilous frontier. Spanning 665,384 square miles, 1,723,337 square kilometers, Alaska is by far the largest state in the country, accounting for 16% of the entire U.S. land area. The next three largest states combined, Texas, California, and Montana, still don't match its size. Despite its vastness, Alaska is home to only 732,000 people, making it the third least populous state, with only Wyoming and Vermont having fewer residents. It's not just the westernmost state. It's also technically the easternmost, as the Aleutian Islands stretch so far west that they actually cross into the eastern hemisphere. And yes, in certain areas along the Bering Strait, you can indeed see Russia from your backyard on a clear day. Since Russia began its colonization of Alaska in the 1740s, the region has been an alluring frontier for those seeking fortune. Alaska's history is punctuated by a series of booms and frenzies as outsiders flock to exploit the state's natural wealth, with many striking it rich through gold, furs, and, more recently, oil. But it's also a place with deep roots, home to indigenous cultures that have thrived in this harsh environment for millennia. Indigenous groups became adept at navigating this challenging landscape using snowshoes, dog sleds, kayaks, and canoes, allowing them to survive in the most unforgiving conditions. Today, 15% of Alaska's population identifies as indigenous, the highest percentage of any U.S. state. Alaska is separated from Russia by the Bering Strait, where the distance between the two is a mere 55 miles at the narrowest point. During the last ice age, it is widely believed that Alaska and Eurasia were connected by a landmass known as the Bering Land Bridge, or Beringia. This land bridge served as a gateway for ancient hunter-gatherers to migrate into the Americas, populating the uninhabited land. These early settlers spread far and wide, with some moving south and becoming the ancestors of Native American tribes. During the last ice age, so much of Earth's water was trapped in glaciers that sea levels dropped by as much as 300 feet, 91 meters, exposing land that is now submerged and linking regions that are currently separated by water. Australia was once connected to New Guinea, and Britain and Ireland were joined to mainland Europe through an area known as Doggerland. Parts of Indonesia were also connected to mainland Asia. This last ice age lasted from about 125,000 to only 14,000 years ago, a significant portion of the total time Homo sapiens have been on Earth. The ice sheets reached their maximum extent, and sea levels their lowest point, during a period called the last glacial maximum, around 30,000 years ago. Then, about 15,000 years ago, the Earth began warming again. Glaciers started melting, sea levels rose, and the Bering Land Bridge disappeared beneath the waves around 10,000 years ago. So, what was Beringia like? Surprisingly, it was warmer and wetter than one might expect, given that it was Alaska during an ice age. It was a haven for animals like the woolly rhino and the North American camel. The plant and animal life resembled that of Eurasia more than North America because it was separated from North America by the massive Laurentide ice sheet. Scientists believe that it wasn't until about 20,000 years ago that a corridor opened in the Laurentide ice sheet, allowing people to migrate into the rest of the Americas. However, these dates are constantly revised as new archaeological discoveries are made. Russia first established its presence in Alaska in the 18th century, but it was a long journey from Moscow to the Pacific coast of Asia. Russian expansion into Asia began in earnest in the 1600s. Early Russian explorers, known as promyshleniki, meaning your orphan, were merchants and fur trappers who played a crucial role in Russia's eastward expansion across Eurasia, in search of pelts, particularly sable, to sell in Europe and China. As they encountered the nomadic peoples of Central Asia and Siberia, they sometimes traded for furs, but often resorted to demanding tribute or taking hostages to secure pelts as ransom, a practice they would later replicate with Alaska's indigenous peoples. In Russia, the promyshleniki were sometimes associated with the Cossacks, a semi-nomadic group from the Carpathian Mountains. These frontiersmen were granted considerable autonomy in exchange for providing military service when called upon. Given the vast and forbidding environment, oversight was minimal, leading to the saying, "God is in his heaven, and the Tsar is far away." The Russian advance across Eurasia was slow and laborious. They established ostrogs, or trading posts, where trade could be conducted, and agents could levy a 10% tax. However, expansion accelerated under Tsar Peter the Great, who was determined to modernize Russia and compete with the great European powers of the day, reaching eastern Siberia by the 1690s. Beyond the economic incentives of empire building, Russia also sought the prestige of colonies, much like the great powers of Western Europe. With Eurasia under their control, the Russians naturally turned their attention to the Americas, where other European powers had found such success. A Danish captain sailing under the Russian flag, Vitus Bering, explored Alaska's coast in 1728, but it wasn't until 1741 that Bering returned to make landfall. His ship, the St. Gabriel, landed off the coast of Alaska on a small island that now bears his name. Unfortunately, Captain Bering and much of his crew soon succumbed to scurvy and other health issues after landing, leaving little time for celebration. However, the survivors of Bering's expedition managed to return to Russia with 800 otter pelts, which quickly became more valuable than sable. The Aleutian Islands, with their surprisingly mild climate and the surrounding seas teeming with life, soon attracted fortune seekers eager to cross the Bering Sea in search of pelts. The indigenous people of the Aleutian Islands, known as the Aleuts, relied heavily on the sea for sustenance. They invented the kayak and were skilled hunters of otters and seals. The name, Alaska, is believed to have originated from the Aleut language. But, like many indigenous populations in the Americas, the Aleuts were unprepared for European diseases. It is estimated that 80% of the Aleutian population perished in the first generations of Russian colonization, dropping from 10,000 in 1741 to just 2,000 by 1800. The Russians recognized the Aleuts as expert hunters and continued the practice established in Siberia, holding indigenous people hostage in exchange for ransoms paid in furs and pelts. The Russians demanded hunting at levels far beyond what the environment could sustain, leading to the depletion of these animals' populations. When the Russians did offer goods in exchange, they traded liquor and firearms, along with the unintended gift of measles and smallpox. A merchant named Grigory Shelikov saw the potential for a trading company akin to the British East India Company. In 1784, the newly founded Russian-American Company, RAC, established its first permanent settlement on Kodiak Island. Eventually, the RAC was granted a monopoly on all hunting, trading, and mining in the region. In the 1790s, the RAC ended the practice of hostage-taking, replacing it with something equally harsh. Instead of being taken hostage, all Aleutian men aged 1850 were conscripted as hunters for the RAC. Officials were encouraged to marry indigenous women, leading to the development of a significant Creole population with ties to both cultures. But Russian America was not limited to the Aleutian Islands. In 1799, the Russians established a base on the mainland, calling it the Fort of Archangel Michael, in what is now Alaska's Panhandle. A few years later, the fort was attacked by Tlingit warriors, whose decorative arts, including totem poles, are iconic symbols of the American Northwest. The RAC was forced to pay a ransom for the survivors. The Tlingit held Fort Archangel for over a year until a fleet arrived from Russia and bombarded the Tlingit into submission, an event known today as the Battle of Sitka, after the indigenous name for the area. Sitka became the capital of Russian America, complete with its own cathedral and a bishop of the Russian Orthodox Church. The population of Alaska doubled from 1890 to 1900, from around 30,000 to more than 60,000. In 1896, rich gold deposits were found in Rabbit Creek, a tributary of the Klondike River in the Canadian Yukon. Eventually, more than $300 million worth of gold would be extracted from the Klondike. In 1912, Alaska officially became a territory with its own legislature. There, women gained the right to vote 8 years before the 19th Amendment was passed. 1915 saw the founding of Anchorage, described as the softest birth of any city on record, supported by federal money and a ban on gambling, saloons, and prostitution. Alaska played an important role in World War II as a place to mobilize troops before deployment into the Pacific Theater. But it was not until 1959 that Alaska finally became the country's 49th state and the first new one since Arizona, 47 years earlier. Alaska became an important geopolitical location during the Cold War, given its proximity to Russia, with military bases in Anchorage and Fairbanks. In 1971, President Richard Nixon ceded 44 million acres of federal land to Alaska's indigenous populations, along with a $1 billion grant, and today, more than half of Alaska remains federally owned. The sale has loomed in the Russian imagination as well. During the Soviet era, some teachers taught that Alaska was an example of the hubris of the monarchy, expanding beyond its ability to govern. Other teachers told students that there was no sale at all, that according to a technicality of the treaty, Alaska had merely been leased to the United States for 100 years, similar to Great Britain's century-long lease of Hong Kong. With relations between Russia and the US turning worse in the 2010s, some Russian politicians landed on Alaska as a point of contention, looking for errors in the original treaty language that would nullify the sale, or threatening to seize Alaska in retribution for sanctions levied by the US, although even the Moscow Times has called these overtures generally facetious. The discovery of oil transformed Alaska just as the discovery of gold had earlier. With the completion of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, oil money became a significant share of the state's operating budget. 25% of oil revenues are put in an investment account that pretty much bankrolls the state, which has no personal income tax or sales tax. So then where did the myth that buying Alaska was a mistake come from? The idea of Seward's Folly may just have been a creation of historians in search of a good underdog story. Perhaps we should call it Seward's Gamble instead, since it was a gamble that has paid off handsomely in gold, oil, and other natural resources. But most importantly for the United States, Alaska remains a symbol of the frontier, a place where the intrepid can find a fortune, if they are tough enough to survive.